I understand many of you are from Pakistan, which is one of my favorite countries. I was there last November and the year before, and traveled by camel across the Cholistan desert to Uch Sharif. And in fact, the cover of my book on Mary, the Blessed Virgin of Islam, these particular patterns, this is a photograph I took in Uch Sharif of the wonderful tile dome. And I like Multan also. Very beautiful places to be. I've been asked today to talk about a book we published called Early Sufi Women. And I've been interested in Sufism since the 60s. I became a Muslim because I was interested in Sufism. But when I got to Cairo and lived there for 10 years and studied at Azhar, my dream is just to be a simple Muslim. I mean, if I could be a good Muslim, I think I would be nearly like a saint or something. But anyway, I'm very interested in spirituality, and all the books I publish are not, although they are scholarly and translations of Islamic classics, Al-Ghazali and so on, my only interest in publishing is to give books to people which they can use to strengthen and purify their own inner lives. And so therefore, that's my only interest, actually. And so this particular book that I've been asked to talk about today is interesting because it's a book about the early spiritual women in Islam between the 8th and 10th centuries, from Central Asia through the Near East to Egypt. And there was a writer called As-Sulami who lived in the 10th century. And he wrote a very great work. He wrote commentaries of the Quran, and he wrote other great works. But his big work is called Tabakat Sufiya, which is about the generations of the Sufis. And there was an appendix to that work which was lost, and that was about the early women Sufis. And this work has been lost for many, many years. And it so happened that we recovered it from the King Faisal Foundation in Riyadh and gave it to Ruqayya Cornell. She's a Moroccan married to Vincent Cornell, Mansour, and they were at Duke, and she translated it into English. I just wanted to show you something to realize what she was up against. I brought you a couple of pages of the photocopy of the manuscript so you could see how difficult that is.
Yeah, it's so hard, yeah. So many manuscripts.
Imagine that. In any case, I'm going to introduce this subject, and then what I would like to do, after giving you a bit of an overview about the early Sufi women in Islam, I'm going to read you some of the things. They are said by some of these women in the early days so that we can meet our sisters of 1,000 years ago, more, and hear some of their thoughts as well. As spiritual masters and exemplars of Islamic piety, these women served as respected teachers and guides in the same way as did Muslim men, often surpassing men in their understanding of Sufi doctrine, the Quran, and Islamic spirituality. Whether they were scholars, poets, founders of Sufi schools, or individual mystics and ascetics, they embodied a wisdom that could not be hidden. And what's so wonderful about Ruqayya Cornell's book is this the first time this has been in English. And it has each story in English, and then the Arabic is on the other side. The major theme in this work is that of servitude. And of course, we all know that we are all Abd Allah. My name is Aisha Abdullah. We are all servants of Allah. And this was the essence of the Sufism of these early women, according to As-Sulami. Of course, we know ibadah, the acts of worship, are incumbent on all Muslims. There was a Sufi in Baghdad in the 10th century called Ibn Ta'a, and As-Sulami quotes him as saying, Ubudiyya is a combination of 4 traits: to be true to one's covenants, to preserve moral rectitude, to be satisfied with whatever one finds, and to patiently bear what has been lost. It also means the suppression of the desires of our lower ego, or our nafs. Salvation from the nafs, says Ibn Atta'ah, can only be purchased with servitude. The nafs, by its nature, hastens toward disobedience, but through effort the slave restrains its evil desires. He who abandons effort has given free rein to the nafs and ignores discipline. It is for this reason that Al-Junayd has said, now this is really quite profound. When I read this, my hair stood on end. It's about the nafs, our ego. Al-Junayd said, "He who helps his nafs attain its desires is a partner in the action of his nafs." That's pretty scary. Of course, we all know about servitude because if you think about it, we are all servants of each other. We serve our children, they serve us. Our servants serve us, we serve our servants. You know, it's an incredible interweaving of servitude. But for a Sulami, being a slave of God, Abdullah, was a necessary prerequisite to becoming a friend of God, Wali Allah, and finally a saint. As a spiritual method, the practice of servitude works on the outward and inward natures of the human being at the same time. Outwardly, it cultivates the Sufi attributes of abstinence, patience, poverty, humility. Without these attributes, the human being is a slave to his own ego. Inwardly, the practice of servitude cultivates fear, worshipfulness, gratitude, reliance on Allah, tawakkul. These are the attributes that lead to perfection in religion, ihsan. There was a certain female Sufi, Suraya, and she said, "The ultimate of what is said to be the best of knowledge is the knowledge of lordship, and its opposite, servitude. Eventually, servitude vanishes and only lordship remains." I guess we can say that's La ilaha illallah, in the path of emptying ourselves to become full of emptiness, or faqr. Without that emptiness, there's no place in our beings for the remembrance, or the zikr, the remembrance of Allah. So she is saying that finally, through our servitude, when we become completely empty of all the things which distract us from Allah and His service, then the Lord, Rabbina, descends and fills us, and then really there is La ilaha illallah, the true state. Another wonderful woman, for example, al-Fadl, used to do public teachings in Nishapur, attended by some of the great Sufi masters of that city. Another teacher, Shawana, from the Persian Gulf, preached to the people and recited the Quran to them. Her sessions were attended by ascetics, worshipers, and those who were close to God and the masters of hearts and self-denial. Hukaima, another important figure in Syria, is described as the ustaz, or teacher, of the female Sufi, Rabia bint Ismail. Women Sufis sometimes taught other women Sufis. And then, and they had great schools with many, many disciples there. This is the early school of female asceticism in Basra, and later there was another school in Syria. Aspects of this early female asceticism was also weeping. Women wept, and this, he says, Sulami, this practice appears to have reflected remorse for the sinful nature of humanity. And sometimes women wept in conjunction with what they call wara, the systematic avoidance of anything that might be either ritually or ethically impure. It entails an understanding of the human body as a sacred vessel, which can also, this idea, be found in early Christianity. Just skipping to something. The description of these early Sufi women is something which really I think we are incapable of today. They were very much isolated. They sometimes stayed alone for years. They did great philanthropy. They were really ascetics. And I concluded from this, since they were very near to the time, much nearer than us, and to even the way of purity, I think they're very close to Sayyidatna Maryam, the Virgin Mary. This other book I just held you up, called Mary, the Blessed Virgin of Islam, was a doctoral thesis by my friend Alea Schleifer. And Abdul Hakim Murad, who will be speaking to you this evening, wrote the introduction. He's a dear old friend of mine. And this describes how the Muslims from Central Asia to Spain focused on the Virgin Mary over centuries. I mean, much more so than the Christians. And it's quite interesting, some of these Muslims, there was a great debate over the years that because revelation came to Mary, she was even considered to be a prophet or a prophetess by some. But Mary, as we all know, as Muslims, is a symbol for both men and women. She's considered the highest woman in all creation. And the reason she's a symbol for both men and women is because of her incredible submission, symbolic of the religion of Islam itself. She therefore furnishes a model for those who follow the teaching of the Quran. A central aspect of Mary's submission is located in her devoutness and her steadfastness in prayer. During the period from infancy to puberty, when Mary led a hermit's life in her mihrab, she acquired fame for her persevering, untiring worship. The Quranic attribute for Mary, al-Qunut, according to Ibn Kathir, means humble, pious obedience to God and surrender to his will. Ibn Kathir cites the early commentator, Mujahid, to the effect that Mary stood in prayer until her ankles became swollen. Al-Uzay observes she was tranquil in her mihrab, kneeling, prostrating, standing, until perspiration poured from her feet, and after the angel gave her the command to obedience, she stood up in prayer until her feet hurt, flowed with blood, and festered. Her prayer was performed in the most intense sense. In fact, during this period of her life, she existed solely for that purpose. And as we know, both Khadija and Fatima were considered the best women of their times, but Mary has been considered again as the best woman of all times and a sign for all peoples, in that the purity of her spiritual striving is a supreme goal for us all, awakening us to the pristine vision of the meaning of obedience, devoutness, and worship, the inner reality of the believer. And so, with this in mind, I would like us all to take some counsels or reminders from some of the early Muslim sisters that we have. And so I'm going to just tell you about a few of their names and where they lived, and maybe something that they said. I will not, as you all know, with hadith, there's always an isnad. So-and-so told so-and-so told so-and-so that the Prophet said this. There are isnads with all of these, but for the sake of brevity, I will not do the isnads. I'll begin in the 8th century with Miriam of Basra. And she reminds us very much, we're always told, trust Allah, don't worry about your sustenance. Some of us struggle and strive to have enough, but I was told in my studies and by Muslims all the time that what we will be receiving in terms of our livelihood is guaranteed for us, so we don't have to have anxiety. We can be like birds flying and fold in our wings, and we won't fall. We don't have to keep flapping. And she says it very nicely. Miriam of Basra. I have never been preoccupied with my sustenance, nor have I exhausted myself in seeking it from the day I heard the statement of God, the glorious and mighty. For in heaven is your sustenance, as is that which you are promised. Here is Shabaka of Basra. And Shabaka maintained underground cells in her house for her female students, where they learned self-denial and spiritual practice. She used to say, souls are purified by acts of worship. When they are purified, they find peace in worship. just as before they were burdened by it. Sometimes people find, is this sound on the microphone bad? It keeps,
Yeah.
it's
kind
bad,
of
huh?
a little bit,
Is
yeah.
it better back here? It was all right? All right.
Oh, I bet
Here is
it's,
Aisha of Merv. I was very lucky. June last, I went to Central Asia to visit the Muslims of Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and I came to the city of Merv. And here I'm reading about Aisha of Merv, or Mary is the other word for Merv. And I went there, and there was this incredible city. Of course, it was now in ruins, you know, little rubble, and I walked through these vast expanses of little broken pieces of pottery and picked up little blue pieces of pottery from exactly the era in which Aisha lived. She said, "The intellect of the Gnostic is the mirror of his heart. The heart is the mirror of his spirit. His soul is the mirror of his intellect. His quintessence is the mirror of his soul. Divine acceptance is the light of the mirror, and the sharpness of his insight reveals to him the difference between error and correctness." Oh, this is very beautiful. Here is Aisha from Nishapur, the daughter of Abu Uthman. And she conformed, it says, to the requirements of the moment. Have you heard the term Ibn Waqt, to be the son of the moment? And you hear this phrase in Sufism, that we should be present. The moment we leave the present moment, al-Waqt, if we are in the past, we may be regretting things. We may be anticipating or expecting things in the future. And both of these are just dreams, and they cause suffering. But in the divine moment, in the present moment, we are always all right, you know, in the divine presence of Allah. And she said finish right now?
Just short.
All right.
Please.
She said something very beautiful about why we should love each other. For he who loves the craftsman glorifies the craftsman's handiwork. Well, I'll see if there's any one more thing that was particularly good. It's all good. I'm sorry not to do Rabi al-Adawiya and so on. Yes, Rabi al-Adawiya said, "I ask God's forgiveness for my lack of truthfulness in saying I ask God's forgiveness." And a man came to her and he said, "How sorrowful I am that I don't do such and such things in religion." And she said, "Do not lie. Say instead, how little is my sorrow." And then, it's too bad to have it eased off because now I have all these wonderful things they said. Anyway, I think you ought to know a couple of things about their relationship with men just before I end. Here's, do I have another 2 minutes?
Take it. Go ahead.
Oh.
Short. We all want to listen in Habiba.
Well, the next section I was going to speak about was the relationships all these Sufi women had with some of the great Sufi men and great men of their times and how they were teachers. And also then I thought I was going to end with the relation of these women to their own deaths and their own shrouds. You know, Rabi al-Adawiya and various people, you know, they took their shrouds that they were going to be buried in and they kept them in their place of prayer. I've done the same thing. I took my shroud and washed it in the Zemzem and keep it where I pray because of the brevity of life. It's a very good way of remembering that life is very short. But these are just all things they said with men. Let's see. And then here's one, Harun of Damascus. A man said to her, "Do you desire death?" She said, "No." "Why?" She replied, "If I were disobedient to a human being, I would not want to encounter him. So how could I desire to encounter God when I have disobeyed him?" And Here's a man who visited Rabia al-Adawiya before she died. I visited Rabia when she was an old woman of 80 years of age. She looked like a shrunken old watermelon and appeared to be on the verge of collapsing. In her house, I saw a worn rectangular mat and a clothes rack made of Persian reeds. The door to the house was covered by a skin. There was a jar, a mug, and a piece of felt for her bed and a prayer rug. On her clothes rack hung her burial shrouds. And she wore this shroud made of hair at night when she prayed. And then she told Abda, her friend, "When I die, wrap me in the shroud. This will be my burial shroud. This will be the thing I pray in and I'm buried in." And let's see, Well, I'll close with two lines. This is a very beautiful line. The people of the world leave the world without tasting the most delicious thing in it. This is the knowledge of God Most High. And I think that's the aim of Sufism. We're so busy with maintaining our lives and displays of all that we have that we may miss the most important thing of all. And this is what I'd like to end with. This is from Abdullah, and she lived in the 9th century. And her husband was a disciple of Al-Junayd. And she said, "Being in the company of one's spiritual brethren in this world is the consolation for being in the abode of materiality." And I feel that about being in your company. Thank you very much.